Hi, and welcome to Series 3 of the Pen to Publish podcasts with your hosts, Alexa Whitten, author, typesetter, and independent publisher, and
Alexa Tewkesbury, author, editor, and proofreader.
Hi, and welcome to episode 2, Typefaces. Now, this is such a broad subject. I'm actually going to be breaking this typeface subject into 2 parts. So this is part 1, the do's and don'ts. Today, we're going to be talking about typefaces. Now, in last week's episode, I explained that typeface is another word for the commonly used term font. Typeface is the correct term, and it refers to the family name of the shape of the letters. So, for instance, Times New Roman is a typeface. Gill Sans is a typeface. Font refers to the style of typeface. So, italic is a font, or bold is a font. So when I'm talking about typefaces, I'm talking about the family name like Times New Roman. Now, why do you need to know about typefaces if you're handing your book over to a designer? Well, it's because what typeface you choose will speak volumes in terms of personality and look. And it's something you should be familiar with so that you can give an informed decision when discussing design elements with whoever you're getting involved with your book project. So personality. Choosing a typeface for your project is a massive part of your book's personality. It can speak without saying anything. It can convey a mood, a tone, and it's really important to be part of this decision-making process, especially if you're writing a children's book. Now, Alexa One, when you were publishing your books, did you have a say in what typefaces you wanted to go with your story, or did you just go along with what the publisher suggested?
Well, my books have all been published by traditional route publishers, so I didn't self-publish, but I can imagine that if I had self-published, the overall design would have been something that I'd really have wanted to be involved with. With the picture books I've written for SPCK, who are a traditional publisher, we did email back and forth quite a lot about the illustrations. They're not my illustrations because I'm not that clever like you. You're a brilliant illustrator as well, as I'm just discovering. There are many things about Alexa 2 you don't know, audience, and you need to find out. But anyway, the commissioning editor did send the illustrations back and forth, and we talked about the colours and the various elements in the picture. There was one series in particular that had a little mouse and it wasn't on all the pages, and I thought it would look good to have it on all the pages. So things like that we discussed. But I didn't have any queries about the typeface used, but I think if I had, we would have discussed that. There was, funnily enough, actually, it's just occurred to me, there was an issue with the commas on this particular typeface. Commas were very small and they looked a bit like full stops. So they did adjust all the commas, but that wasn't something I knew they could do. So I didn't bring that up, but they emailed me at one point and said that was something that they had amended. But the actual typeface itself, it looked really good and really appropriate for the books. And the cover, the typeface on the cover looked good as well. But I think if I was to self-publish, choosing the font, and especially on the cover, I think that must be a really creative and exciting part of the process. And presumably there's a lot of sample looking at in that process.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that a little bit later on, actually, because it's a really important part when you're self-publishing. You have these options, and it's interesting hearing your side of the publishing route, obviously, because most people listening to this are going to go down the self-publishing route. It's quite interesting having you gone through the traditional route. Obviously, it wasn't even up for discussion, and I find that quite interesting. Typeface obviously wasn't even part of a conversation they had with you.
I mean, there's 2 publishing houses that I've been published by, and neither time was the typeface discussed, actually, which when I knew what you were going to be talking about today, I did find that really interesting, that wasn't, I mean, I suppose if I'd said, I don't really like the typeface of this book, maybe they would have told me why they'd chosen it or something like that, but it wasn't initially part of anything that we talked about.
Interesting. Well, I mean, if you've listened to series 1 and the interview that we did with Kylie Dixon, author of the Ink Cap series, and yes, we can say series now because her second book has now been published, her typeface has become synonymous with her story. The letters just look mushroomy. They really do.
They do. Yeah, they do. And the covers really convey the sort of magical tone and the feel of the books. And a lot of that has to do with the typeface used for the book titles. And I think Kylie's covers are a really great example of why the typeface matters so much and is worth taking time over when you're choosing something for your book cover. It's also why having a professional typesetter is so important, because they can advise you based on their experience and what they know works well for particular types of books.
So yeah, I mean, we had the conversation with Kylie about obviously her typeface, which is called Remedy OT, and she really loved it. Now, she ended up having to go and pay for it because it wasn't a free typeface. And I'll be talking about more about this later on in this episode, but certainly in the next one. It's something that you have to remember, that you might have to go and buy your typeface too. So where do you find them? Well, actually, you find typefaces everywhere. I mean, you just go into Google and search interesting typeface, and you'll have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of results. But the best place to start is with your designer. If they know what they're doing, then they'll help you find the one that is right for your project. This is something I feel you should do together, and I'm often having Zoom calls with my authors-to-be to go over the different options. One author took several hours to find the one that was right for her. The book was all about a hedgehog called Spiky. And although we wanted a spiky style typeface, we didn't want it too spiky. We didn't want it too triangular. So as you can imagine, it was quite hard for one to be, to fit the brief. She also wanted her body copy. Now, this is obviously what the main book is displayed in, to have personality. And we found one that fitted perfectly. Again, this took quite a while to find. She had sent me a book where she loved the body copy typeface. Now, I know I'm quite good at my typefaces, but I can't just randomly look at one typeface and go, oh, I know what that is. And I wish I was. Do you know what? There's actually a Facebook group called Find the Font, because they're going with the alliteration of the F's, finding the name of a font that people see out and about. I mean, that's how so big a subject it is. And there's I think there's like 10,000 members to this Facebook group.
I must join.
Huge. Now, the typeface that she liked, I was able to get one that was very similar. One of the places you can find, or you can start to find, about what typeface they've used, because in old-fashioned books, they usually list the typeface on the title verso page. I don't know if you know that, but they used to.
No, I didn't know that.
They don't seem to do that anymore, but older books, they list the typeface, which is quite interesting. But this particular typeface she wanted had a single story A. Now, what I mean by that is, you know how you write an A? It looks like a C with a closed C. So it's a single story A, whereas most typefaces have a double story A, as in with the little curly top to it. Do you know what I mean by that? So if you go and look at a single story A of how we're taught how to do an A, the double story A, which is the one that has the tail that goes over the top of it and then around. So she wanted a single story A. And you know what? Typefaces with a single story A are quite difficult to find, interestingly.
Yeah.
So that was an added complication. Anyway, we found one which was great, and it fits perfectly within her book. What we also had to do is make sure that the title, as in the title of the book, Spiky, went with the body copy, because obviously the two need to match. Not match, the two need to complement each other. This is why it's really important to work with someone that knows what they're doing. I've also just run a typeface workshop in my Facebook group, The Reluctant Writers, as it's such an important subject. And we looked at why it's important to know the differences of style, but also where you can buy them. And yes, not all typefaces are free. In fact, just like with pictures, you need to have a license to use them. So make sure that whatever one you use, check out the license that comes with it, because that's really important. Places you can buy typefaces from are extensive, but there are a few of the more common sites which I'll list in the show notes. Font Squirrel, Dafont, they're all places where you can go and choose typefaces and then see whether or not you need a license. A lot of typefaces will allow you to use a typeface for personal use for no money, But as soon as you get into the printing side of things, you usually have to get a license. And a typeface can cost anywhere from 25 quid and up, depending. Right, the cover. This is the biggie. All of this research is so that your cover, the first thing that most people see, has the most impact. Getting the typeface right on your cover will then, or rather should, filter through then into your book. My preference, especially for business books, is that the cover ties in with the insides. I usually have the title typeface used as subheading typeface within the book. Or if it's a children's book, where you might not have subheads, I would use it on pages like about the author or any other additional pages like acknowledgements. I would use the title typeface for those particular pages.
See, that's such a great idea, because I suppose it's providing something like a sort of visual theme, and it certainly creates a really cohesive look and feel to the book, which all adds to the professional presentation of self-published books. And it's not something, I'm a writer and an editor, and I've said before, I don't know anything about this next stage in the process, but I would never have thought of that. And that's where your design expertise comes in. You know, it really makes the book shine in its presentation.
I mean, this is just something I suppose I've learned from my designing business books. Obviously, now that I'm doing more children's books, it's like, well, why can't the same apply? And I love the fact that on like Jodie Hayes' book, Wally series, her title typeface is lovely. And then I've used it again on the about the author and the acknowledgements. It just kind of ties it all in. So
yeah, I love that sort of thematic idea.
Yeah. So getting the right choice will influence the rest of your book. So what style of typeface in terms of the bigger detail, we'll be talking in the next episode, because it's such a broad subject. There's no way I could have fitted it all into this one. So I spoke earlier about spiky. Well, what I actually ended up doing was I produced a style sheet that had, you see, this is where we might get semantics style sheet, because obviously editors like style sheets for their different types of words and colloquialisms and how they spell I am to I'm, etc. I have style sheets which talk about the more decorative side of things. So what I did with Spiky was I had the title typeface and then I had the body typeface literally right underneath, so they could see how the two look together. You'll often find also when you come to look for your typefaces, font pairings when you're looking for them. So you might find their suggestions useful as well. Ideally, you want a contrast, but one that's complementary. So if, for instance, if you have a very swirly title typeface, you might then want a very plain body style. What you wouldn't want is a swirly typeface title and then an additional different swirly typeface body font. It's too much. You want contrast. Or if you have a very chunky title, you want a more softer body choice. What you don't want is a heavy title and then a heavy body copy, because it's just too much for the reader. I'd also make sure that you see your chosen typeface in both capitals and non-capitals, so uppercase and lowercase. And make sure, if it's appropriate, that it comes in all the fonts that you want. So italics and bold. And not all typefaces come with those options. There's nothing more frustrating than choosing the perfect typeface only to realize that it doesn't have a bold or italic font. You can manipulate that in InDesign, or rather I can manipulate it in InDesign, but it's always better if the typeface you've chosen has it as a specific font rather than adding strokes or using the angle option in InDesign. I had to do this recently with a project where the creators of the book has actually designed their own typeface, which you can do. I wouldn't suggest you do that because it's quite a complicated process, but it didn't come with an italic style. And I ended up having to manipulate it in InDesign. Now it works, but it's not something that I would want to get into the habit of doing because I think it looks just a little bit off.
And you see, I would never have known that. I just assumed that every typeface was available in bold and italic as well. But that's a really good point about seeing how a typeface looks in the various fonts, because obviously it needs to be clear and easy to read no matter what font it appears in. And if the italic font of a particular typeface isn't that clear, and the italics are a feature of a layout. So say in, blocks of text are italicized, which can happen in both fiction and non-fiction for various reasons, then choosing a different typeface I can see would be the best thing to do, because you want your reader to be able to read without anything getting in the way.
I mean, it's interesting because there are some books that I read, fiction books, where they obviously have an italic version for someone's thoughts, for instance. And I really don't like the way it looks, and it's hard to read. Now, I had that with a client of mine. She loved the body copy as regular, but she didn't like it as an italic font, but she didn't want to change the family. So what we did was I was able to change in InDesign. Anything that was in italics was actually able to be a totally different typeface altogether. But you wouldn't have thought they were. But the italic font was much more legible. So you're right, it's all about legibility, which leads us very nicely onto legibility. So all of this careful planning is because you want your book to be legible. We've spoken about this in episode 1, and this is where it comes into play. There's no point in spending lots of money on an editor if your book is then hard to read. And what typeface you choose has a massive part to play in this. Even if the overall design is bad, if the typeface is clear, then you're going to be helping your reader. Ultimately, you want both, as in good design and good typeface, but I can't stress enough the importance of legible typeface. Now, pair this with good, clean design, and you're going to get the best of both worlds. So how can you get this easily? Well, hiring a designer that knows what they're doing for a start, but here are some handy tips to get you started. Have a nice contrasting typefaces. So think of the title and the body copy. Using box outs and pull out quotes. Now, I'll be talking about this in next week's episode to make your writing really stand out. And making sure that you use correct margins for your book. Again, going to be talking about this in another episode. You don't need to worry about this if you're using a book designer, but if you're going to be using anyone else, you need to make sure that they understand the differences between left and right pages and margins, and that the text isn't centralized on the page. If that has happened, then they haven't allowed for the space that the spine requires. In my book, How to Create a Children's Picture Book, I go into all of the specifics of this, and I'll post a link of where you can get that in the show notes. Having text that is too close to the edge of the page will just look wrong, or conversely, too close to the inside edge. This is why I can't stress the importance of good design and using someone that has done books before. And be wary of anyone that says, oh, my mate Pete, he did my website, he'll be able to format my book. Web designers aren't book designers, nor actually are most illustrators. If an illustrator says they can format your book, make sure you take a look at the books that they've done before.
You may recognize this message actually from series 2, which is if you want to produce a book with a professional finish, from the words to the overall content, to the layout, to the cover, then please do invest in a properly trained editor and a properly trained book designer. You won't be disappointed, and in fact, you'll be far more likely to be thrilled with the end result and get better reviews.
Exactly. I recently went to a book launch, and there was another author there who showed me her book. And I have to say, I couldn't read. She'd typeset her own book. I couldn't read it. She'd chosen the wrong typeface. She chose a sans serif font, which I'll be talking about next week, which is really hard to read. And the blank pages that were supposed to be blank, had page numbers on them, had headers on them, just looked unprofessional. But anyway.
Which is such a shame when all the effort has gone into writing it, creating it.
I can't stress enough to get someone who knows what they're doing. But anyway.
Yeah.
Getting the right typeface and the right design and making a cover that pops, what do they all have in common? Well, it's all going back to knowing who your audience is. For instance, if you're writing a book for children who has learning difficulties, then you might consider using a specific typeface that helps that. Obviously, the biggest issue for children with reading can be dyslexia. It's a huge issue, and it's one of the reasons why dyslexics struggle to read is that the typeface that's chosen isn't conducive to their condition. In fact, there is a specific typeface called dyslexia that has been created, especially for children who suffer with dyslexia. And I would definitely choose this option if you're writing a book targeted at dyslexic children. The worst kind of font that you could choose for a dyslexic reader is a serif font. But what I always tell people is to choose a serif font, because for people that don't suffer from dyslexia, it's much easier to read. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but I'll be talking about the differences between those two in the next episode. If you're writing a business book aimed at men, then a swirly, girly, hand style typeface subhead probably isn't going to appeal. Just like a bold, stern typeface like Impact probably won't suit a book aimed at women. I don't mean to sound stereotypical here, but it is very true. You're not going to want a swirly typeface for a book aimed at computer programming. And I'm not suggesting that only men go into computer programming, but you're not going to want that kind of typeface for that kind of book. So to wrap up this episode, here are the main points to think about. Choose your typeface wisely with your designer if possible. Make sure you like all versions of it and that it has different fonts. Get the right license. Choose one that fits the style of your book and for your audience. Make sure it's legible. I posted on LinkedIn recently a typeface where the T and the R on a word made the shape of an F and a U. And the word was trick. So I'm not going to spell out what that actually looked like, but let's just say.
You see, they should really have brought in a proofreader for that, because proofreading is for more than just books.
Let's just say that sign really shouldn't have been used for children. Let's just say that,
yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
Anyway, next week we'll be covering the minutiae of typefaces, and we'll go into more depth of style and how you can make your design even more legible with things like box out and pull quotes, which I mentioned earlier. And we'll also be looking at contrast, which is the two main styles of typefaces, which are serif and sans serif, and why knowing that is important. So for now, we hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you here next week for episode 3. Bye from me.
Thanks so much for listening. And I don't know about you, but I'm loving finding out about this side of book production. So roll on episode 3. Bye-bye.